Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us here for this session. This is Human Factors Engineering in New Product Development. So glad you're attending the conference and that you're attending this session as well. Excited to go through some of this material with you. First off, myself, my name is Tom Kramer. I am the president and CEO of Kablooey Design. Kablooey Design is a product development company that's been doing med tech product design and development for 30 years. Actually, today is the day of our 30-year anniversary. So a lot of human factors engineering, design in med tech space. So this is a fun topic for me and a fun topic for our team as we work in this industry. So excited to jump into this. So let's get going here. Human factors engineering is all about usability. And in fact, those terms get used interchangeably. And even in a formal standpoint, they do, because the European standards that we follow for this kind of work, and most European work comes from a standard called 62366, and they use the term usability engineering. Other standards like we have here in the US, the American standards and HE75, oftentimes use the term human factors engineering more often. So in any case, they're interchangeable. But the idea behind usability is making things usable. How do we make them usable for the people that we're trying to address? And there's tons of reasons why that's important. And some of them I think make a lot of sense and are obvious to you. But I want to share some insights about how to think about usability and how we approach it. When you think about usability, one of the most important things to realize is that it's a very holistic endeavor, and it takes a combination of skills and talents. And I believe what I've seen over the 30 years that works the best is having this combination of having an artistic sense and then having a technical and a mechanical sense. And combining those two things together will really help you prepare yourself to head down the path of usability engineering or human factors engineering. And I love to show this example of Leonardo da Vinci because there's nobody better than him to demonstrate what an artist and a technician can be. And this is some of his art, which is phenomenal. And then he's got so many mechanical, technical things that he dealt with. It's perfect right brain, left brain working together type of a thing. And that's really the holistic world that usability thinking lives in. So when we go down this path, we start to ask ourselves, well, how do we make things usable? What do we do to make things usable? And the one thing that we have to realize is that good product developers that are going to succeed down this usability path, they must have a couple of things. You must have, a good manufacturing and engineering expertise, as well as a design and artistic experience. That's that Leonardo da Vinci thing, but it spans into manufacturing and real world technologies, and this design, user-centered design leading into usability kind of thinking in essence. And that's important. And one of the reasons that's important is because it helps eliminate this problem of a designer making something that's pretty, but it can't be manufactured, and it leads to a huge headache, or it can't be used effectively by the user. And that, of course, leads to failures out in the marketplace, which is what human factors engineering is all about, avoiding those kinds of failures that are based on usability. So we want to avoid those things. So when we embark on this path of developing something, there's a ton of things that we have to think about as designers, engineers, developers. But when it comes to human factors engineering, two of the most important are the ergonomics and the human side of things. Human factors is all about the capacities and limitations of the user. So the definition of human factors, it's an applied science, coordinates the design of the devices and the things with the working conditions, with the capacities and limitations of the worker. And those are the two important key terms right there. Capabilities or capacities, limitations of our user. That's what human factors engineering takes a look at and addresses. And of course, we want to mitigate any risk or errors or misuse that might lead to marketplace disadvantage based on those capacities and limitations. Now, there's a lot of misunderstanding about human factors when people talk about it. I hear people talk about it all the time. I get clients that say, hey, let's spend some time looking at human factors. And sometimes they're misunderstanding the term or the definition of what they really want. And sometimes when they say, hey, let's spend some time looking at human factors, sometimes what they really mean when they're misunderstanding things is let's make something look good or feel good. That's not what human factors is, but sometimes that's what they're thinking. And what they really mean when they're saying that, I think, is they're saying, well, let's find out what the user wants, and then let's find out what the user needs to be successful, and let's find out what's going to make this easier for a user to interact with, and then let's develop some design concepts that address these issues. Now, when they're thinking all those things, now they're thinking like human factors engineering is intended to operate. But oftentimes, they're not using the term the correct way. So what they mean and what they say often are two different things. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what is human factors not, because there's a lot of paths that are important, but they're not necessarily human factors engineering. And first and foremost, human factors engineering, it's not clinical psychology. So, understanding what our users are thinking and feeling, that plays into human factors, but it's not the clinical psychology itself. We want to understand what a user is thinking or feeling in so much as it interacts with their ability to successfully engage with the user interface on our device or our system. That's the important part that we're looking at. But it's not the psychology itself. We do analyze their behavior, and we do want to understand their emotional and their mental and their behavioral responses, but it's all in that effort to understand, well, what are their mental capabilities and their mental limitations, okay? It's not just common sense. I've heard a lot of people say, well, come on, it's just common sense to make our device this way because we don't want people getting hurt or using it incorrectly. Of course we don't. And we're not designing it so that happens. But really, common sense oftentimes is just hindsight to use error. So you see use error in the field, and then you react to that, and it's hindsight. And then, but human factors engineering is all about discovering what those use errors can be and mitigating those risks ahead of time before they actually happen. So it's pre-common sense. It's not just testing for user preferences and finding out, does our user like item A or does our user like item B? Those things are important, but those things don't really deal with the capacities or limitations of your user. They just deal with their preferences. Now they can come into play. And it's not industrial design. Industrial design is what do we do after we understand what the limitations of our users are? And then we do something about it. Now, that doing something about it, that's part of a human factors engineering plan. There's a part of the plan where it says, okay, you've learned some things, and now you need to do something about it. You need to design something and design it well so it mitigates these risks, these user risks. But it's human factors engineering isn't industrial design itself. The two use each other to accomplish common goals. Okay, so they work hand in hand. And human factors engineering occurs down the development path while industrial design is going on. So what is human factors? So it's a discipline, and it's a discipline that quantifies human performance and capabilities and limitations, like we already defined in the definition. It's data-driven, meaning it's going to be defensible to a regulatory body, and it's used to mitigate use error and safety issues that arise from use error. It's also intended to be compliant with regulatory standards such as ISO 62366 or HE75 and follow these steps. And I think it's a really neat window when you're understanding what human factors are to look at 62366 and see what the deliverables are that they're asking for here. There's 10 sort of deliverables that they're saying this is what you have to do if you're going to do human factors engineering on a medical device. And you can see what these things are: documenting the process in a file, identifying the most important characteristics that relate to how a user uses the device, identifying these frequently used functions, identifying hazards and hazardous situations that would be related to how a user is going to use it, identify the primary operating functions, and then develop a usability spec and then a usability validation plan. How are you going to validate that your concept is meeting these things in the specification? And then you design number 8, that's your industrial design there, design and implement the user interface. And then you verify that your design meets the user interface requirements, and then you validate its usability. And this verification and this validation, this is done with formative studies and summative studies that you do throughout your development process. So these things occur during the development process. They start early, and then they happen throughout the development process as you're making things and you're testing them and you're trying them all the way to the end until you validate your final concept. So it's not something that you slap on at the end, that you try to do after you've made something and you try to write a report that says, by the way, this meets human factors requirements. You can do that, and it might work, and you might get lucky because you might have developed something well, but that's not the way you're supposed to do it. So why is all this important? Well, there's a number of reasons. First off, consumer, as we all know, consumer devices and clinical devices, they're converging and becoming the same thing at a very rapid rate. And this is very important because as these consumer vital trackers and clinical grade devices converge, we understand that this is happening because there's a huge push towards home healthcare and a huge push towards empowering patients to take part in managing and controlling their own health through interfaces such as digital interfaces and device interfaces. So usability and how the user sometimes now in these situations is changing from a clinical user to the patient user. So as we look at things that we have to think about when we're designing a device that might have previously been a clinical grade device and now it's going to be used by a consumer, there's a ton of things that we have to think about. And here's just 9 simple ones right here that I put down. But when it comes to human factors engineering, some of these things are extremely important. And these 4 things are directly related to human factors engineering, making sure our device is simplified enough for the patient, but sophisticated enough that a caregiver is going to get the data that they need out of it. That's something that's going to require some human factors engineering. Also, with high-risk patients, say like seniors, for instance, with a lot of comorbidities, nurses aren't paid and around to react all day long. So the device, the system, is going to have to react. The patient is going to have to figure some things out themselves. What are their cognitive limitations and capabilities? That's human factors engineering. Devices are expensive, but apps are cheap for people to buy and use. So what can we work and put into an app? There's human factors engineering that goes into making people understand how to correctly use an app without error. And making it usable and well understood by a tough population like, say, seniors with a lot of comorbidities. That's hard to do. We often think of this inverse rule when we're in this situation designing things like this. The more likely you are to need technology, the less likely you are to be savvy with it, okay? Seniors with comorbidities who are at home trying to take care of their own health, they're not the ones that are writing the code for digital medical devices at home. They just need it to do what it does. So that lack of understanding about technology, human factors engineering, goes into understanding how we make something usable by those people. If we think about understanding all those things, it's very much in line with something that Einstein's famous for saying. And I love his quote where he said, if I had an hour to save the world, I'd spend 55 minutes defining the problem and only 5 minutes finding the solution. Understanding what these needs are ahead of time, what these potential risks are ahead of time, that's defining our problem. And it all comes down to what we call design research. So if we were going to develop something without human factors engineering involved at all, we would still need to do a certain amount of design research to understand what we have to design and build. When we use human factors engineering, this design research becomes part of our usability studies. Our usability studies grow into the human factors engineering process. But it's all really based in what we call design research. So the process for developing clinical devices is very rigorous. And here's the process that we use, that we developed. We call it our D3 process because it starts with design in mind first. And it's a design-driven process, and it goes through these stage gates. And it's got all of these user groups here. These are the people involved, and these are the steps that we go through. These are the decisions that have to be made, and these are all the activities that occur during this process. So there's a lot going on. And I've highlighted in green here that this was for a particular project. And these are the areas that our team, the designers, the engineers are involved in these steps. So there's a lot going on in the process. But an important thing to remember is throughout that process, human factors, and I mentioned this before, human factors is not a one-time event. in the development process. You saw how complicated that process can be. Human factors engineering is a series of ongoing activities that are executed throughout that entire development process. That's how human factors engineering is meant to be done. And if you're going to do a regulatory submission, and part of your regulatory submission is to show a usability engineering file where you've done all these human factors engineering activities, if you can't show that you've incorporated them all throughout that process, some flags are going to go up during your regulatory submission. So you got to be aware of that. This is a simplified way. This comes off of our training site, but this is a simplified way to look at the process. This orange box here is that complicated chart that I just showed you. It's that chart just banged down into this little orange rectangle. These are those 7 phases. So I want to take a look at how would we go about human factors engineering throughout these 7 phases of a project. And what are some of the things we would do? And so I want to show a little case study here. So in a case study, let's look at a device that was developed for prostate surgery. So this is something that we actually did. This is a real case study. So we were taking a look at prostate surgery, and in the beginning of this development process, we're in this early evaluation, in this early research phase. So if we think about all of our other design controls, everything that's going on with our quality management system and design controls, we're really in pre-design control phase right here. We're in phase 0 at this stage of the game. But human factors engineering activities begin in phase 0. So some of the things that we would do are ethnography. When we're in phase 0, ethnography is a great tool because in phase 0, we haven't designed a concept yet. There's no prototype to look at. There's nothing. But what we can do is we can look at what are our users doing now with perhaps a predicate device, and how are they operating in this scenario, and what's working and isn't working for them, what's difficult. That's what ethnography does. So in ethnography, what you want to do is you want to be like a fly on the wall, and you want to watch your users in their environment doing what they do without you disturbing their activities. Okay, it's not a focus study, it's not a focus group, it's not an interview. It's you being this invisible fly on the wall watching what they do. So what you have to do is you have to get into situations where your device is going to be used. You got to get into the environment, and you got to get those behind those users. So these 2 people in the foreground were our users, and that was us in the background watching this device being used. So we do that, and we look for things. We're looking for all kinds of things. Like, for instance, we're looking at the user's posture when the user is going through certain stages of the procedure. We're looking at the user's interaction with the device. So the user interface on this device was very much a hand-controlled, manipulated user interface. And we're concerned about what his hand is doing, especially when his attention is elsewhere. You can see the user is obviously looking somewhere else for information, but yet their hand has to be interacting with the device. That's important human factors engineering data. During different phases of the device, the hand switches to different controls. It's controlling different things. That's important data. Things become difficult during different parts of the procedure. The posture changes. The device orientation changes. The orientation between the user and their hands and the user interface changes. These are all very, very important things for understanding the capabilities and limitations of our users and what might introduce a risk situation, a misuse situation. Look at how the user's posture and hand position changes during this part of the procedure. Okay, everything changed. You can see how that would be stressful. You could even see the muscles tensed in the user's arm as they're trying to hold the device in this orientation for an extended period of time. All important things. See, we're not just looking at how the device works. Okay, we're looking at everything in the interaction between the user and the device. Also, where was that user looking and during the procedure? That's important for us to know. Not related to the device we're designing, related to the world that the user is working in. Very important stuff for us to understand. Okay, so we do some of those early studies. This is called contextual inquiry. We do this at the beginning of the process. We're in phase 0. We're trying to learn stuff. We're trying to do what Einstein suggested. 55 minutes understanding the problem, okay? Quick example, a few things we learned during there. Two areas were very important to us on this project. Semantics, meaning cognitive things about the user, and then capabilities, physical things about the user, okay? Cognitively, the users had trouble understanding how this camera that they were using on this device rotated and what orientation they were in. Semantically, cognitively, they were having trouble understanding when they should use one hand, when they should switch to two. Okay, physical capabilities. Their wrist during rotation of the device was very difficult. Their wrist, their arms, and their neck, and their shoulders during an entry time were very difficult. Standing versus sitting seemed to be a need to change. That was difficult. Head, neck, and shoulders, and wrist angles. All these things were very difficult. Okay, these were things that we logged as pain points that were very important. We call them pain points, and they lead to us understanding some things down the road, which we'll talk about in a second. So, in your design controls, you move further down the development process. Now you get into phase one of your design controls, and you start coming up with concepts. Okay. So our human factors engineering process is jiving with our design controls. We get into phase one here, into this ideation phase, and we develop some concepts. So we start with simple concepts, drawings, sketches, 2D schematics, layouts. We show them to users. We talk to users. We have interviews. We get some feedback. We're doing this kind of simple stuff. We also do some simple, what we call 3D sketches, meaning it's as simple as a sketch, but we might change from what you saw the user using before in a predicate situation. And we take some, and we actually did this. This is actually from this project. We took some PVC plumbing pipe, cut it apart, glued it together, and did a bunch of those very quickly. Took no time at all. And these became 3D sketches that we put into the hands of our users. And we were able to go back and do more contextual inquiry. And we were actually able to make some what we call formative studies, which are early studies and tests where we can learn some things. And we went back to the users and we did usability studies, okay? So in these usability studies, we now put those simple things in front of users and asked them some questions. We went a little further down the road then, and we did some more highly refined mock-ups. So on the left, you see some foam mock-ups that were just solid dummies. We were able to get some data around how the user would hold this, when they would interact with certain controls, what they were thinking when they would interact with these controls. Very informative. And then those gradated to a little bit higher level device that you see on the right, which was then sort of a 3D printed model that actually had buttons and things that actually worked. And then they could take this into a simulated use environment and actually go through the steps where they would use it. And you can imagine we would get more feedback in those usability studies because we learn more things, we see more things, we understand more pain points. Okay, and here were some of the pain points we found when we advanced through those two levels of usability studies. Cognitively, semantically, button locations were confusing for the users. We discovered that they didn't understand how and when the flush should be used. They didn't understand how the safety button should be interacted with. Okay, those are pain points. Physical things, the button locations. One of them was very difficult for a user to reach and to use and to engage. Okay, that was a pain point. So we discover these pain points. These pain points turn into user needs, and we write them up as user needs, which then go into our requirements document as user requirements. And these become design inputs for our DVT testing. So these are inputs into our design controls, but they're usability ones. Okay, so we get further down the road, and my point here is just that we get into this design phase, and we start making better, deeper prototypes. So now these prototypes are more highly designed, they're a little bit more highly refined, and we start creating prototypes now that can go into formative studies. So here's an example of an actual prototype that was now a working prototype and could go into actual formative studies. So we write protocols, we go into formative studies, and these devices are used. Now, we also do usability studies at the same time. So lower level usability studies can be done in simulated situations like this, where we have dummies and we're looking at space constraints and we're getting the prototype in there. So we're doing those kinds of usability studies, but then we're also going into not only using them ourselves, but we're going into actual simulated situations with real users, and we're discovering more pain points. And we're creating these mock use scenarios, and we're getting more pain points. And then we go into real use scenarios where now we can go into cadaver labs with users, we can go into animal labs with users, and we do actual setup with actual users, actual technicians, and we log these as actual formative studies where we've got a protocol, we've got data collected, and we've got a report that gives us some of our usability that will all lead to those user interface requirements that come out of it. Okay, so all of these are examples of, and there's other peripheral users. That's one thing you have to be aware of. There's setup technicians that have to be involved. There's nurses that have to be involved. There's the physician that has to be involved. So we're collecting data from all user groups as we do this. And in the end, you can see that there's cadaver studies, multiple people involved. Okay, so now in these formative studies, we're learning a lot of things, and this becomes more well documented. We have to test 6 to 8 users. We have to have a protocol that says what we're testing for, and then we have to see if what we're testing for was successfully completed in the test. Okay, but we discover more pain points, and that's what a formative study is for. So in this case, from a cognitive standpoint, camera turning confusion was worse. We came up with some solutions, and they became more confused about how this camera was going to work. When they were setting up the device, there were so many cords and complicated things to do, they got confused with their setup. Capabilities. Leg space made it difficult to turn this device. Elbow and wrist bending was constrained. Wrist rotation was very difficult in one direction and became worse. The end of the bed interfered with rotation of the device. The grip size was too big for some of the users, and buttons were hard to push, and some people had to take 2 hands. There was too much force required. Okay, these were just some of the pain points that we discovered, but we're discovering more and more pain points as we go through this development process. And you can see when we get to the end of the process here, now we start getting into, so those were alpha prototypes. Now we're kind of getting into this beta prototype phase. And when we get into these beta prototypes, then we move from this kind of testing and thinking about last minute configuration things that we want to try. And we start taking a look at, can we take last minute configurations, and can we learn from what's worked and what hasn't worked, and can we learn from that and put it into a final configuration so we can go into beta testing. And this is what the final configuration turned out to be, that had all those pain points were mitigated with design efforts and design changes. We mitigated those pain points, created design criteria or design inputs in our user interface requirements, our user interface specification document. And then we designed to that, and we made those changes, and this is what the device turned out to be. So then this was our beta prototype device that would now go into your design validation. So we would do verification and validation in your design controls, but from a usability standpoint, we would do our usability validation with this device through what we call a summative study. And this is where we get 15 or more users. They all use this device in a real world situation. And we document whether all of those hazardous, potential hazard, use hazard situations are mitigated and are acceptable at the end of their use. And we record that, and we have a usability report that comes out of a summative study. And then we have a usability engineering report that sums up the entire thing at the end. So that's kind of how we go through this process. So when we go through this entire process from left to right, we use those activities that I described, and it's a very linear process. But the thing to remember is that there's iterations throughout this linear process. And these iterations start out as big iterations when we're early, but as we get further and further down the process, these iterations get smaller and smaller and more focused on minute little details and minute little pain points that we're discovering. And we're not like redoing the entire design by the time we get to the end. As you can see, the change from the alpha unit to the beta unit was minimal when it got to that testing. And then that beta unit is then what went into official clinical trials because it passed all of our studies at the end there. So that's how we go through this. And it's important to understand that we begin in this early research phase. That's where human factors engineering begins. And then it is involved in all of these design iterations that occur throughout the development process. So just to kind of wrap up, one thing to understand is that I always say that process is just as important as the product. If you can't take the product through that development process, you're not going to have the product that you want or need at the end of your process. So you got to have a good process that incorporates all of these things that we've been talking about. So thank you very much. That's everything that I had in this sort of quick overview and quick study of human factors engineering. More than happy to answer any questions. And as always, my contact information will be available to you through this conference. And feel free to reach out to me directly at Kablooey at any time at ideas@kablooey.com. More than happy to answer any questions, even after the conference. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Tom, for that presentation. That was great, and I'm glad it was all smoothly from a network perspective. Looks like no one had any issues during this presentation, so thank you again. Tom's hopping on the line here. Should be coming up now. Hey, Tom, can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine.
Okay, perfect. Thank you again for that presentation. Okay, so now we're going to get started with our Q&A in just a moment here. Again, I'd like to encourage any audience members who have any questions for Tom, feel free to put it in to the chat box here, and we'll try to get to it if we have time. Okay, so Tom, first question here. What are the major differences in the various guidance documents for human factors?
Okay, so there are a lot of, there's several different guidance documents that we reference when we're putting together a human factors engineering plan. And there's different reasons why you might want to look at different various ones. But there are, I don't know if I can do a screen share here or not, but no, let's just talk through it. So, the main ones that we reference are 62366, which is a sort of an international document. And then there's also HE75, which is an American national standard. And then the FDA has also released some guidance documents. The main one is 1757, which was released by CDRH and the FDA. So these are great. These three are kind of, I think, the three core ones. There are other ones too. There's documents that have to do with combination devices and things like that. But these three really do the heavy lifting. And if we were going to talk about the difference between those three guidance documents or what they would focus on, you might think of 62366 as having its focus on the possibility, or excuse me, on the process. So it focuses on the process of usability. But then it's also, taking kind of a deep look at how usability engineering and your risk management efforts, how they dovetail together, and they do a good job of talking about that, because your risk management data feeds into your human factors process quite nicely. From an HE75 standpoint, taking a look at that, again, that's an American national standard. It's a much longer document than 62366 because it spends a lot of time talking about other aspects of the development process altogether and how you can approach different aspects. So really the focus of HE75 is more on the tools that you use in the development process and when you're doing human factors engineering, and sort of the methodology that you would go through to implement those tools along the way. So it's kind of a comprehensive reference, and it's got the general principles behind it, but then it also talks about use error and risk and design elements and how you integrate these into a solution. And then the third one that I think is very valuable, the FDA guidance document 1757. The really focus of that is trying to help you to have a smooth experience with the FDA during your regulatory submission. So, that is a shorter document. It's very brief. I highly recommend that. And it really describes the activities that you can go through, that at least the essential activities that the FDA wants to see you do, that'll maximize the likelihood that your devices, will be safe and effective for their intended users and their environments. And then it goes on to share some of the practices that you can incorporate in your process that will, help you minimize potential use errors and harms, things that might result from harms, and then help you assess and reduce these risks that would be associated with the device. So those are the three major ones, and the differences between between those three. All very useful.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Thank you for the clarification. Okay, so the next question we have here is, what are the major differences between European usability work and US human factors work?
Yeah. So, that American National Standard HE75 and 62366, each one of those, they weren't done in a vacuum. Fortunately, they reference each other. And HE75 actually references 62366 as a good resource for understanding how your risk management plays into your human factors plan. So you can reference these documents to sort of look for these analogies or these differences. But just by looking at that, one could say, well, there's a little bit more of a tendency to put an emphasis on risk management in the European National Standard and to look at risk. On the flip side, on the American side in the U.S., there's a lot of focus on the steps and documents that you use to prepare for your final validation study. And in Europe, it's more about just submitting your final results. So there's some differences like that that can be nuances. And really, both processes are meant to be very similar because the U.S. process doesn't intend to ignore risk management, at all. It takes it all into account. So I think some of the differences are really small nuances, and it might be focused on what kind of documents do you want to provide to the FDA for your validation, and the FDA is looking for a lot of things. And your validation in Europe oftentimes tends to stand more on its own, where you're submitting your results. I mean, that's one area that I can think of. There may be others, but you kind of have to think through your device, your process, what you're stepping through.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Looks like the next question here is another valuable one. What are some of the biggest pitfalls in human factors engineering work?
So, we were just talking about this today with some of the people on the team. Mm-hmm. Because what we see often is it tends to happen with maybe less experienced groups or smaller startup companies. Your larger OEMs, have kind of their systems down. But oftentimes, a small startup. If you think about a startup medical device company, they're often started by entrepreneurs who have a particular expertise or background. They're a scientist, they're a physicist, they're a doctor, so they've got training in this one area. And oftentimes what happens is developing your idea or your device in a startup company to the point where you're going to commercialize something takes a lot of disciplines. I might say I'm a physicist, and I'm doing that work, or a chemist, and I'm doing the science to make my device work. I might tend to sort of put blinders on to all of the other expertises that are necessary, all of the industrial design, the mechanical engineering, the electrical, the hardware, the human factors, the marketing, the clinical, the regulatory, all of those people. And what's easy to do, especially in phase 0, is it's easy to minimize these other groups and their contributions. So it's easy for me to say, well, hey, I got to solve this problem and make this chemistry work here. And those other things, let's say, coming up with a regulatory plan, that can all come down the road. And so I minimize it. Now, you kind of have to do that in feasibility a little bit, because you can't do everything at the beginning. But the risk, the pitfall, is you push that down the road, and then you just keep kicking all those cans too far down the road, where you really need to start engaging all of those disciplines and budgeting for them and planning for them in your schedule and your plan. For instance, and the reason I bring that up is that applies to human factors. So a lot of times people think, oh, human factors, finding out what users like and want, can do that at the end. I got to make this thing work. So they start, and all of a sudden, you're out of phase 0, you're past phase 1, you're into phase 2 and 3, and now you've got a device, and you've done some verification, you're getting ready to validate this thing pretty soon, and you realize you haven't done any human factors work. So now you try to go back and do it retrospectively, and that can be difficult, unsafe, and it can be very expensive if you have to change things, because when you go into mitigate risk to change things, there's kind of a triangle or a ladder of best practices. So if you find some human factors risks and you want to mitigate those, the best thing that you can do at first at the top is to make design changes to your device. So if you're in the validation stage, it's kind of late to be making big changes to your device. So you want to do that early. That's why you have to start the human factors work early. That's the big pitfall, is not starting it in phase 0 soon enough, like I mentioned in the talk. And then the next thing you might do, if that's not possible, to change the device itself, kind of the next best thing is there some sort of add-on to the device you could do? Can you easily, without changing the whole device, can you manufacture a little shield that protects a button so it doesn't get pushed, or something like that? And then if that's not even possible, kind of the next thing is, okay, can you inform users? Can you write instructions in the instructions for use document, or can you put a label on that has an instruction or something? That's kind of a last resort. If you can't mitigate the risk with that, then you're kind of hurting. Then you got to go back upstream, and late in the game, that's hard to do. But early in the game, it's easy. So you start your human factor stuff right at the beginning, and you start with those early contextual inquiries where you're looking at what your users are doing in the world that they live in, like I showed in some of those examples. You can do that early on before you have a concept. Just see what they're struggling with now before you even have a device. That's where you want to start. And I think the biggest pitfall is just waiting way too long.
Okay, got it. No, thank you for that comprehensive answer. The next one we have on the list here, what are some of the best rules of thumb for making sure that FDA is happy with your submission?
Yeah, so there are obviously the FDA is looking for some things, and there are some things that you can do that I think that they tend to focus on. And the first thing is, they really want you to provide them with all of the human factors data that you have so far, that you've accumulated up to this point, before you do your validation testing or your summative study. They really want to help you form your summative study. They want to help you write your protocol and make it more effective so you have a higher chance of success. So in order for them to do that, they want to see all your formative study data. They want to see all of your usability studies. They want to see the documentation where it shows the risks that you discovered, what you learned, how you mitigated those risks in your design, and what you did in your design. So they want to see all that. So this is why you do have to start early, because you have to collect all of this data and then show it to them early. So I think that's one thing that you can do. And of course, that happens oftentimes in pre-submission meetings. And so that's another thing, is they're really big on pre-submission meetings. So make sure you work those into your project plan, and that will really help you make things smooth with the FDA too. But also there's a couple of other things I think that are important to remember with your human factors and the FDA. And one is, I think they tend to like the idea that you do your summative study or your human factors validation, that you do that before you do large clinicals, if you have large clinicals planned. Now that's not a hard, fast rule. It's more of a general guide or a rule of thumb. But they like to kind of see that you've learned, you've validated the human factors part before they're going to go risk this on people in a large clinical trial. So if at all possible to do that, you can do that. Now that's not always possible depending on your device. Sometimes in order for it to be validated from a human factor standpoint, it has to be done in a clinical. And of course they realize that and they understand that. But I think it's a good rule of thumb. And then I think the last thing that makes them happy is you could potentially avoid human factors engineering altogether. And that sounds kind of strange, but the idea is they want to see your risk assessments that you've done. And if you've done some decent risk assessments, and your risk assessments, you can show and make an argument for the fact that human factors engineering doesn't have to be done, they want to listen to that. And they will listen to that and evaluate it, and potentially agree with you that you don't have to go through all of those studies and that human factors validation study. Now you have to have course, good reasons, and the reasons are that you've done the risk analysis, and the probability and the severity of the risks that would arise from this are negligible, and you can kind of get off the hook for doing it at all. So those kinds of things I think are best practices, rules of thumbs when you're working with the FDA.
Okay, got it. Thank you for providing clarification with the FDA. The last question we have that we've received is, how do I know if my device will need a human factors document for our regulatory submission?
Okay, so that kind of ties into what we were just talking about. Like I just described, you can evaluate your device with your risk management, and your risk analysis can show whether or not you need to do it. Now, there's lists of devices that they've put out there, and I don't have them memorized, so I can't tell you what they are, but the FDA has put out lists that say these kinds of devices should have human factors engineering. Some of these don't necessarily, and again, it's not hard, fast rules. They're rules of thumb, but I think there's 3 things that you should look at to ask yourself if your device should have a human factors engineering file. And it's not just a single document. It's what we call a file, and that file is at least 10 or more documents that demonstrate all the human factors work that you did. So the question is, should you have a human factors engineering file? So I think the 3 things to think about first are your users. If your users are patients or home users or not highly trained clinical personnel, you pretty much should just off from the get-go decide that you're going to do human factors engineering, just because of the risk level of that user group. The second thing you want to take a look at is predicate devices. Do predicate devices, have they had issues in the past? Were there recalls for these predicates that our device is going to be like, and were there risks there? Because if there were, you're going to want to do human factors engineering to help mitigate those usability risks. And then I think the third thing to ask yourself then is about the use case and the environment. So the environment that it's being used in, or the use case that it's being used in, is there inherent risk in that? Is it a risky situation? In some of the guidance documents, they just they make it too plain and say, well, if your risks look like that it needs it, then do it. Well, I mean, that's pretty bland, but I think what they're saying is examine that use case, and does it seem risky, and examine the environment that it's being used in. Are there potential risks and hazards that could enter from the environment and the use case? So you analyze those 3 things, ask yourself those questions in the beginning, and you'll kind of have a good idea for whether or not you should have a human factors engineering file with your project. Do it early, because if you do need one, you have to start in phase 0. And then if you don't think that you do, then start your risk management work early, get yourself a risk analysis, and then use that risk analysis to make a case to the FDA that you don't need a human factors engineering file. So that's how you want to go about it.
Okay, got it. No, that's great. Okay, I think that's just about the last question we have on hand here. Tom, I'll leave it open to you if you have any other points that you want to touch on before we wrap up.
Just to wrap it up, and we covered a lot of things there in a very short period of time. Obviously, there's courses on all of these things that last for semesters. But there's a few things. There are a few items that I didn't get to that might be handy to remember. First, your validation study. Okay, that's your summative study. We talked about when to do that before a big trial. But there are some best practices for that. You have to have at least 15 users for each user group. So if you have physicians and nurses are both users, you got to have 15 physicians, 15 nurses. They each have to go through a use case scenario. And you have to have a nice protocol written that talks about the criteria that you're going to meet to show success, and that all of the usability risks have been mitigated. So they have to be sort of quantifiable. So those things are important when you do your summative study, which is called your usability validation. And then we talked about the timing of it. There's also questions about the type of device. Like, you may have to do it before your large clinical trial because you may need to be using a device that isn't the final one. Now, in that summative study, if at all possible, you want to use an exact final device, but sometimes a very, very close replica, like a beta prototype, is good enough, and it can be used in a simulated situation, not on an actual patient, but with an actual user. And that can work for a summative study, and that's a reason why your summative study would be outside of that. And then the last thing I want to leave you with is, as you go through all of this human factors engineering work, one good practice to keep in mind is when it comes to, what you're really doing is you're meeting user needs. So there's potentially usability issues that could lead to risks or hazards, but there's usability issues, and you're trying to solve those usability issues. Now, sometimes people tend to look at these usability issues as one big issue, and it's very closely related to the issue that your device is solving. For instance, let's say you were creating a device that removed plaque from leaflets of a heart valve, okay, because they get calcified. That's your one main issue. There might be one main user issue around that it's difficult to navigate the space to get a catheter there. So you might be tempted to spend all your time on the navigation of a catheter through the vasculature. And the important thing that I'm trying to drive home here is make sure that you back off from that and take a bigger picture look, because that may be the core issue, is difficulty navigating. But around that main issue, there's going to be tons of tiny little peripheral user issues that surround that. And that takes investigation, that takes contextual inquiry, interviews, questions, observations, and you start seeing all these little tiny issues that surround that major issue. And then you're going to include that into your human factors documentation, and that's going to feed into your design. And when your design starts addressing all of those issues as well as the major issue, you're going to have a much more innovative device and a much more well-functioning device that's going to meet users' needs, which in essence then should make it more of a success in the marketplace and get into the hands of more users and help more people and save more lives. So keep that backed off vision in your mind as you go through all of your human factors work, and you'll have a much more robust human factors effort. And there's tools and tricks and techniques for how to do that, and would love to answer any follow-up questions about those tools and techniques afterwards. You'll get my contact information through the seminar here, and more than happy to continue the discussion afterwards.
All right, thank you for that, Tom, and thank you again for all the effort you put into this presentation, as well as the thoughtful answers to the Q&A portion as well. Thank you.
You bet, Dylan. Glad to be here. Enjoyed the conference. Thanks so much for putting it on.
Oh yes, of course. No, it was our pleasure. We're just going to be wrapping up here in a moment. I wanted to thank everyone for joining today who attended, even if it was for just a few minutes of one presentation, or if you stayed all day for all 5 presentations. But I also wanted to give a special thank you to our partners, not only from Kablooey Design with Tom here, but also with Orthogonal and Nelson Labs, all outstanding organizations that I hope to one day work alongside again soon. So thank you to our partners. I know they put a lot of effort, a lot of time into putting together these comprehensive and thorough presentations. So special thanks to them. And again, we will be following up with the contact information of all the presenters today. So if you have any follow-up questions or something comes up later in the next week or so, you'll be able to contact them or reach out to them directly. So that just about wraps us up here today. We will be following up with recordings that will be sent to all attendees who registered, or all registrants, I should say. We'll have access to the recordings. But that just about wraps us up. Thanks again to you, Tom, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their day.
Thank you.
Thank you.